I'd like to welcome you to Anatomy and Physiology, and this is Dr. Brian Shmaefsky. I'll be your instructor. I'd like to give you a brief introduction to the course, how to navigate our D2L, and go through some of the class expectations before we begin our formal lectures. And just to give you a little about me, I've been teaching at Lone Star for over 26 years. I actually started out in the biotechnology program and then eventually moved into teaching anatomy and physiology, and now I'm directing the environmental sciences. My research background is in environmental toxicology, where I still get involved in different types of research, mainly in aquatic environments. I used to be an animal pathologist, actually, looking at diseases in marine mammals. I also was an industrial biochemist many years ago, using my basically physiology background to produce chemicals that we use in diagnostics and research chemicals. Currently, I do a lot of presentations and have written several books on A&P and human disease, and I give talks related to that and also talks on science in general. And my latest use of my physiology background and the person I'm standing next to was one of the earlier people that stayed on the space, that worked on the space shuttle and also lived on the space station. It's Dr. Michael Lopez Algieri. And I'm involved right now in the safety of space flight, particularly for commercial uses. And so there's been some incredible applications of my anatomy and physiology background lately. What's very important to you is our D2L course site. So this is the section that you'll be registered for, and basically every week I'll be posting 1 or 2 videos that correlate with our course. So please make sure you check your D2L email, and also daily check the D2L site. Every time I post something, you should be getting an email to your D2L, but this is going to be your lifeline to the course. So all of our lectures will be recorded lectures, okay? And I'm also going to be giving you other video materials. So when you go to the D2L course site, you're going to be most interested in going to the content site, and yours is going to look a little different than mine. You're not going to have the edit course features and some other stuff, but your main thing is to go to the course content site and regularly check this area called the table of contents. And you can see already what I have early in the course posted is I have a drop-down table for introduction, your syllabus, which is posted, lecture videos, which is right now only going to contain this video, and you'll be seeing different assignments, okay, posted here. Your first assignment that I'll talk about is to be a disease paper, and I'll discuss that more in class. I also posted the PowerPoints that go with our book. It's going to be a little different edition, but they haven't changed that much because some of you will be having the 9th, 10th editions of this book. You'll also see test reviews, which are posted now, just to give you an idea of what the test will look like. So you'll see similar, but maybe not identical questions. And as we go down here, you'll also be having practical exams. So I'm giving you study guides for the practicals, particularly what bones and muscles to know for this class, and also sample questions of what your practical exam is going to look like. And a practical exam is typically done in class, okay, using specimens and PowerPoint slides for you to identify parts. So again, the D2L is going to be your major resource, and if you ever have any questions about that, please email me. So as we move on, when you go to the syllabus section of your table of content, and again, you're going to be in your content section of your D2L homepage. You click on syllabus, and you'll see this right there. I do give you the book that we'll be using, and we could use the 8th, 9th, or 10th edition. I prefer that you don't use the 8th because some of the information there is lacking that's in the later books. And also, unfortunately, we have a lab manual just printed for this course. Typically, the lab manual for this course costs almost $200, what I'm finding out. So we have a trimmed down one that's a little less expensive, but it's only available through our bookstore. But if you go online, you may see a Marieb Lab book that is written for Lone Star College Kingwood. It could actually say that. And I believe that's printed by Benjamin Cummins. Pearson, I believe, which is Benjamin Cummins is a subsidiary, also publishes a Marieb book. So you're looking at Marieb 8th, 9th, or 10th edition, Human Anatomy and Physiology. Okay, and please, when we do come to class, have your textbook and lab manual available every time we meet, because we're going to be working out of it and using it as a reference in the lab manual we'll be needing for you to do your lab activities. As we further go down the D2L course site, this is what the PowerPoint sections look like. So I give you the table of content, which is pretty consistent between the different editions of the book. And then down here, you're going to see the different PowerPoints just for this semester. Because if you take the second semester, you may have a different set of PowerPoints. I don't know. So I only posted chapters 1 through 16 of the PowerPoints. And the PowerPoints for the chapters are breaking down into subdivisions. The goal of the PowerPoints is not for you to memorize everything on it, but to use as a reference, particularly when you're studying for your exams. They make very good bullet point references. So I'm going to use those PowerPoints and shorten them as a way of producing abbreviated lectures, but still be aware that the content from the PowerPoint is very important. Again, on your course site, here's what the test reviews look like. This is going to be a hyperlink right here. So when you press on this, you'll see a review for test 1, test 2, test 3, and of course the final review, which is a cumulative final for this class. Because technically you're going to be moving on to hopefully AMP2, and the content of this course is fundamental for understanding AMP2. Plus, as we cover content early in semester, a mastery of the earlier content is essential for knowing the rest of the chapters. And I really do mean that, because this course does build upon itself. So as you go through the tabs under the table of content, I'll be opening up what I call these little windows, and these will have content changing all the time, except of course for the syllabus introduction and the test reviews. But I will be adding to content, because part of this course is doing case studies and other features. Okay, so basically live on that D2L course site. Check your D2L email, because that's how I'll be responding to you and talking to you. And please reply back to me in D2L, because sometimes if you use the regular college email, those emails go into spam no matter how many times you've emailed me and I've replied. So again, look at this table of contents and pay attention to these as these change. Okay, because I'll always be adding material. And as I add lecture videos, please pay attention to particularly this section. I'll be adding new videos as the content goes along. And what I'll try to do is post a date time, a start time, and an end time for that video. That means that you should have looked at it within a certain period of time, and that should go to a calendar that's linked to the D2L email. So check your D2L course site, because this is a hybrid class and it's rely on you studying the PowerPoints and studying the lecture material I give you. So as far as class expectations go, as far as grading, there'll be 3 lecture exams which are worth 100 points each. I will be giving case studies. That means several case studies throughout the semester. And I know this is going to be a very tight semester and only about 6 weeks. We'll be covering this content, but the case studies will reinforce your content. That's going to be worth a test grade in itself, so please don't ignore that, because that can be the difference in a letter grade. Lab assignments are very critical for reinforcing material, so these are going to be worth a test and a quarter, plus all of us assign a disease paper, and you're going to see the format of disease paper. What we want you to do is report on an anatomically or developmentally based disease, not an infectious disease. This is not a microbiology class. What we're looking at are diseases that are due to body trauma, that are due to natural causes, or due to developmental defects during birth. And I'll be mentioning a little of this as I go through the video lectures. We'll also have 2 lab exams. That means 2 practical exams. Each are going to be worth half a test grade. So, but this is very important to do well on these. And to be honest, these are going to be your hardest exams. So if you're looking at making up, grades in particular, focus on your lecture exams and make sure you get into lab materials and case studies. It's not to say that you can blow off the lab exams or miss them, because they're still worth a test grade. So this should all hopefully add up to about 900 points. And the grading scale is going to be roughly this. And what I do tend to do is a statistical variation called a Q. And what that means, I'm going to look at the overall test average, throw out usually the highest grade and lowest grade to look at how this scale works. That's why you're going to see that this might not be absolute. So sometimes, on the average, okay, 810 to 900 might be an A. Points, it means out of 900. But it might be nobody gets hundreds on the exams, or 90s in some cases. That's possible in a semester. So this scale would be scaled down a little. But seriously, the course content that I test on is very critical, not only for A&P, but any following classes that you're going to be using, whether you're pre-med, allied health, or going into kinesiology. So my philosophy of the class is not just memorizing. I'm very much into critical thinking. And part of the times that we meet, we're going to be looking at case studies and then doing labs. So I want us to think about the content and use the content in problem-solving situations. We're going to evaluate the content and also reason through that content. That means, why do we need to know this? So it is going to be important to memorize stuff, but it's going to be equally important on how to know to use this stuff, because memorizing is not going to get you through life. What gets you through life is how you apply the content and how you're able to integrate the content into solving problems, and how to also look for new content that you need, that means stuff we didn't cover, to help solve that problem. So just a little background information. I'm going to go through this real briefly because I don't want this to be a prolonged lecture, but I provided you some slides basically on anatomy as a science and its historical development, the branches of anatomy and relationship with other disciplines, because this isn't mainly focused on anatomy class, but we are going to go into, of course, physiological principles. So we're going to look at the levels and methods of anatomical studies. That's very important, and your book goes through that a little. Also anatomical position and directional terms, because this is to be fundamental, and I'm going to reiterate this and stress that you, particularly in your lab manual, you regularly review this. So I'm going to give you just a little introduction to this and why it's important. Also, the whole idea is that when we study anatomy, guys, we are studying what's called the norm. And the norm means what is a typical person, which is ridiculous because we have to take into account gender, ethnicity, and other things, that there really is no typical human. But we have to come up with some consensus of what a human is, because everybody's going to have anatomical differences. And my first job, actually, because I didn't go to college first after high school, I went into X-ray technology, and I worked as an X-ray technician. And I remember from doing dozens of X-rays in the short time that I did the job, I ran into incredible variations, including people that had reversed organs and uneven organs and missing organs and extra parts. So we have to take into account what we normally call abnormalities. And I don't consider an abnormality a disease. I consider an abnormality meaning that it's some type of calculated or quantitative or calculated difference between what we identify as the norm. So we're going to learn that in anatomy and physiology, everything comes with variations and ranges. And if you're outside of that range, it means that it's an abnormality, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a disease or it's a handicap or hindrance. And I come from a family of handicapped parents, and I was born handicapped myself. And I don't consider that to be anything that hinders life in general. So we have to be careful for working in this field, is that there is an incredible amount of variation, considering that genetically we have the DNA of our ancestors in us, including a fair amount of Neanderthal and literally other organisms in us that make us incredibly variable. And our own environment causes modification in the body, something called epigenetics, that adds to this whole range of what is normal. And then we're going to look at what's called constitutional types. That means, what are how do we measure norms? And how do we categorize the body into 3 types of norms? Because we're going to see there's not one body type, just like there's not one gender. So when we look at anatomy, we have to separate anatomy from the physiology part. And with anatomy, I'm just going to briefly say it deals with structure, shape, form, but not the function of the body. From anatomy, we can hypothesize function. Just like from function, we can hypothesize anatomy. This is called form and function. But anatomy is going to be the study of many things that have to do with the form, including the origin of regularities and irregularities in the body. So please read through these slides to get a little more. The problem with anatomy and physiology, besides all the content, is that you're looking at another language as we go through this course. The terms in anatomy and physiology and in medicine in general are going to be based on, some Arabic origins. We're going to see some, particularly mostly Greek and Roman and Italian words, because it was basically in Italy after those Greek and Roman eras where medicine as we know it today developed. It's not saying that other cultures had medicine, but the medicine that we study is based on the old Italian medicine. We're going to see that Germans and people who spoke Old English also had an influence on the spelling and the terminology. And as we learn more things, we can see that different countries like Germany and America contribute terms unique to our own languages. Now, this is also going to be true when we look at pronunciation. People who speak American English versus Queen's English are going to pronounce terms differently. And there's also going to be different from people that pronounce terms with their own language influences. So Italians might pronounce some of the terms differently than Germans and again, people that speak other languages. And I come from a multicultural background, particularly from an immigrant family. So I learned both American English, Queen's English, German pronunciations, Russian, and also Hungarian, which is some of the languages we used at home. So when I pronounce things, don't use that as the end all of how it's pronounced. Pay attention to your surroundings and pay attention to particularly spellings to understand the word from being pronounced different ways. And also be tolerant of how people pronounce terms. Like, for example, duodenum versus duodenum. You're going to see there's a very big debate about that and which term is actually correct. So when we look at the terms, guys, go on the web. When you see terms that are saying, man, I got to memorize this, go to the web and look at the origins of that word. Because anatomy basically comes from the term anato, which means away, and toma or temno here, which means to cut, because temno is also using the word toma, to cut. So this literally means to cut away the body, because the way people studied the human body was to cut it away. And this became abhorrent in many cultures. You're going to see as I discuss the history of medicine. So most of this earlier stuff I'm going to get to after discussing what anatomy is. Okay, this brief history of anatomy and physiology, just for your own knowledge. And again, I won't test you on this, but I'd just like you to know that our understanding of the human body goes back a long way, and well before written history, probably throughout North Africa, the Middle East, and even India. So what your book is based on is what's called the Greco-Roman and Italian history of medicine. And this is where it first started getting recorded and kind of systematic and a little more scientific basis put into it. So I just want you to know, you'll hear a term called the Hippocratic Oath, and Hippocrates is sometimes considered the father of what we call systematic medicine, not medicine in general. And, I just want you to read through the slides. I just want to mention some names and what their importance was. So we can go on from Hippocrates, then move to Plato, and sometimes you hear of Plato as being just a philosopher in himself, but much of his philosophy led to how we understand science and how we understand the organism in general. A lot of the ideas back in his days were incorrect compared to today, but they were still trying to look at this whole idea of the body, of what's called the soma, that there's this physical entity that we have to take care of, and the soul, of course, being a separate thing. But in these days, there was a lot of mysticism still, a lot of misunderstanding of what the body was made of, but he still gave us some ways of dealing with the body, and particularly trying to understand the functions of organs, even though many of their interpretations of organ structure were not correct and based on, again, ancient ideas. Aristotle should be familiar to you too, another classical Greek philosopher, and his interest in medicine was understanding how people develop. Okay, because we had an understanding that something's going on in the uterus, and unfortunately, Aristotle's thinking did not really take into a hold until literally the 1800s. So there was a big error a period where we were not paying attention to development, and medicine was kind of more steeped on mysticism and personal interpretations. But again, he was very interested in a relationship between humans and animals and how we can put together an understanding of them. And probably he was also the basis of animal experimentation to understand us, and also looking at the embryology of other animals to understand humans. And don't even try Arastostrachus as far as pronouncing that name. But again, he was another early pioneer and was more interested in physiology, more of the makings of the body. Now, back then, we didn't understand much chemistry, but he was on the basis of trying to get a rational understanding of metabolism and how organs actually worked with each other and interacted, and particularly gave us the basis of understanding how the nervous system works and how muscle works. So a lot of these early ideas might not have been 100% accurate compared to today's knowledge, but they still form the basis of how we investigate and how we think today. And they also help to form the basis of taking the body apart and looking at it as pieces. Now we're starting to get into the Roman era of medicine, which eventually led to the early Italian medical schools that started around the 12 to 1300s. So Claudius Galen, okay, again, he was a philosopher, just a general, scientist, helped to father biology, and also was interested in anatomy and physiology. And he started becoming a little more systematic about recording medicines, also around that, medical issues. And also around that time, he worked with people on looking at botanicals and early medicines and cataloging. So this was an era right around 100 AD, where people were cataloging tons and tons of information and starting to gather information from other countries and other cultures on how we treat and understand disease. So Galen also looked at this idea of the humors, and because they thought that this spiritual force that worked with something called the phlogiston gave us life, and this life was present in the body fluids. So you might have heard of old practices like bloodletting and sometimes body draining. They used to drain the spleen, the liver, drain the blood, and this was all part of looking at impurities. And some of the idea of Galen's was based on also ancient Hebrew beliefs that there's a form of dirty and clean, or pure and filth, that basically govern the universe and govern the body. So that part of his philosophy was to clean these fluids or purify these fluids, which led to early attempts at medicine using metals like gold and using plants which were considered pure. You still see evidence of this today in these colonic cleansing and naturopathic techniques, and some in chiropractic, and also in a lot of naturopathy. But a lot of this has not ever been substantiated, but even though some of this today is used in alternative medicine, and is not the basis today of traditional medicine, even though he gave us a start on looking at organs individually and trying to understand their physiology. Now, what's interesting about the Roman era is they were criticized the most for focusing almost all their medicine on military, and not so much the general public, and not so much the understanding. The Greeks were more into understanding. The Romans were more into war. And this is unfortunate, because when they started falling, they really left no body of pure knowledge and no future investigation that led eventually to the Dark Ages. And why is the Dark Ages important to anatomy and physiology? Because it was a huge period of time where really nothing was advancing, and people were actually going almost back in time as far as their beliefs, and particularly in how the body operated. So it was really kind of a big period where we lost information too, and particularly the ancient writings of peoples that we didn't like. This was a period found mostly throughout Europe, not so much in Asia, Africa, and other parts of the world, unless the Roman Empire was in there. So here's this Middle Ages now. Okay, the fall of the Roman Empire, we went to almost 1,000 years of not trying to understand anything and going with old ideas. We blamed disease on sin. We blamed it on foreigners. We blamed it on a lot of stuff and criminal activities and whatever. So this really didn't contribute much except to misconceptions that are sometimes even around today, that persist today, and not really in indigenous cultures as much as we find in certain segments of our own population. Now, during this period of the Dark Ages, it wasn't that nothing was going on. There was a lot still going on in the Middle East, where we found ancient medicine was kind of buried during the wars, during the takeover of the Middle East, and now these works were starting to come out, these texts called canons, and they really had incredible documentations of disease. So it was in the Middle East where we find a lot of science growing, and particularly medical studies that really didn't make their light of day throughout Europe. But eventually these works were discovered as we started entering, into this period of the Renaissance after this. And part of that Renaissance period was brought about, of course, by Leonardo da Vinci. And again, I'm mentioning all these people here, but you might not think of an association with anatomy and physiology. But he was, a philosopher, an engineer, a painter, and also was dabbled in science. And part of his genius was that he looked at us almost like an engineer would, like a machine, and also philosophized about our purpose, but also painted us in detail that was incredibly scientifically accurate. And much of his paintings that he made were the basis of modern anatomical drawings today, and also the whole idea of what's called scientific illustration is that you represent life as it is and as you see it, and as this body that's composed of parts, including nature being composed of intricate parts. And he also tried to look at what's called form and function. That means as he drew, he was looking at what is the purpose of each thing and how does it shape determinants, and that still holds true today in anatomy and physiology, particularly when you start getting up into the histology part of our course when we talk about cells. Versailles, okay, and now this is the beginning again of the systematic science, what we call the Renaissance science, where people are opening up their minds to new ideas and given what's called evidence-based science. That means we're putting a little more thought and a little more what we call deduction into our science, or thinking about how things work and then testing them. Galen was involved in, Versailles was involved in a lot of dissections that not only taught us anatomy, but also taught us physiology. And the same was true for William Harvey. That was true for Versailles. Is, again, very detail oriented. We're now starting to see other countries come into play besides Italy. We start to see Germany, England, Spain, Portugal coming up with medical doctors and scientists that were doing all these studies. So based on this foundation of the Greeks, we look at now this newer systematic growth of anatomy and physiology. To what we get is today, what we call modern experimental science period. And understand in the days before the 1700s, people were still kind of metaphysical about how the body worked and how organisms were born and developed. So today, we look at it a little more from what's called a biogenic point of view, that living things come from living things, and that we can be broken down into the tiniest living entities that is explainable in the form of cells, and cells are explained by the chemistry that makes them up, and the chemistry is explained by basically the physical principles and properties of atoms. So you're not going to have to worry so much about atoms and what they do, even though that is important, because atoms form the basis of our tissue structure and the basis of medicine and how your physiology works and why we are limited to particular environmental conditions. So when we start getting into this course, we're going to learn different terms associated with the different branches of anatomy. And for you to know the branches is not that important as much as just knowing that you'll be studying them. And we do divide the body up into different ways. So one ways we can divide the body up is by what's called a systemic approach. And this is kind of approach that's coming back, what's called the holistic approach. That means we don't look at the details as much as the functional relationships between large systems. And this is now becoming a new wave of medicine, or a rebirth of medicine, called systemic medicine. And this is very important in pharmacology. And our book takes what's called a systemic approach. It looks at the organ systems, not so much at the cells, but the organ systems, which you see is the basis of most of the book, and how this creates an organism that is homeostatic and functional and interacts with the environment and other organisms. So most of it is going to be called systemic. Okay, there's also what's called topographic anatomy, and this looks at relationship of portions. This is more important when looking at comparative anatomy, particularly what is the mean type of human, the normal we sometimes call it, or the person that's outside of what's called the mean curve. Because we can put human anatomy and physiology in what's called a bell curve. That means as we measure people, look at their physiology, there's a spectrum of differences we find. And some people fall outside of what's called the norm. That means what is expected in about 88% of the population. And then we tend to call pathology or abnormalities what falls out of that range. That means 12% of the population, 6% on each side of what's called the bell curve. So topographic anatomy was the beginning of measuring that. And they were involved a lot in understanding the shape of the brain and how that affects, how we think. And that's none of it is all necessarily true, but also is important in looking at the skeletal system and muscular system and how stress and genetics affects its development and how then affects the purpose and function of the body. There's also dynamic anatomy, which you see a lot associated with kinesiology. This looks at the support and motor apparatus and how is this affected by different conditions, including anatomical, physiological. And I've been working with this with the space program. I've been a consultant with commercial aerospace right now on factors that affect human health in outer space, and how do you communicate that to people who will be going into outer space, particularly civilian people, not so much government astronauts, because being in a zero gravity environment, we find out, has a lot of effects, and also being in high radiation environments affects how the body works, what we call its dynamics. And then a subset of that is kinesiology or sport anatomy, which you hear in sports medicine. And they look at, the influence of sports on the body, but also how, let's say, different types of muscle tissue, skeletal structures, different body fat proportions could affect the human's performance in sports. And we hear about people testing for what's called slow twitch, fast twitch muscle fiber, which we'll learn about. And that's all involved in the science of sports anatomy or sports medicine. There's applied anatomy, and this was something that was very typical for the Romans, not so much the Greeks, as they were more interested in knowledge. So applied anatomy looks at basically, and it's funny they limit it to artists here, but it's basically looking at, again, body proportions and how do you apply what you see in the body, what you measure in the body, to the function of the body. And then there's an anatomy called normal anatomy, and this just looks at that 88% range of the body, of human bodies that exist today. Because, guys, normal anatomy varied over a lifetime, and it varies even over immigrant families as we move from country to country and settle for generations. We find out that even if we breed with our own type, the body form changes. outside of sometimes the norm. So why do we have this norm? And what's the function of the norm? And what is the function of the body that falls out of the norm, what we call the pathological? And believe me, pathological is relative. Don't ever use the term handicap around me. I do come from parents that were labeled handicapped, and so was I, and two of my brothers. So you have to look at pathology as outside of the realm of what we call that 88%. It doesn't mean that it's a disease. It just means that it doesn't fit into the norm. And in itself is not necessarily a disease, because under different conditions, the norm could become the pathological. We're finding this out with space flight and also with people that move to different altitudes. Now, when we start looking at morbidity, this is something that's a little more serious, because now we start looking at we know conditions that can lead to death. But again, this is under different conditions. For example, a diabetic that is not exposed to, well, I should say a type 2 diabetic, to diets large in glucose, they're not morbid. They don't have an over disease. Okay. Whereas when you put them in a sugar environment, a high carbohydrate environment, or a high fat environment, they show disease. Okay. So when we start thinking about medicine and applying your content to the class, we have to think of all our content in context of all these different anatomical sciences. And in your book, you're going to be looking at more ways that we divide anatomy. But I'm taking more right now of a functional approach. Why do we learn the body? Okay, so when we look at anatomy and physiology, they're integrated, but they're two separate things. When we look at anatomy, we're looking at only structure. We're looking at form, shape, sizes, ratios, okay, placement. Okay, in physiology, we're looking at function. This is more of the chemistry of the cell, which students don't love. But this is very important in understanding how we build an anatomy, literally from a fertilized egg to a human, and also how we adapt to the environment, how we adapt to our food, and how we react to medications, what we call pharmacology, and how we react to other environmental chemicals, which would be called the science of toxicology. So please be in mind that I'm going to ask you to look at the definitions of these terms and make sure that you know it, because you could actually even take just an anatomy class. You can major in just human anatomy, or you can major in just human physiology. But some physicians specialize in more of the physiology, others more in the anatomy, and some specialize on a particular system where they study both. So when we look at human anatomy and medical sciences, okay, again, what we can do is take the body and divide it apart. And we're going to see that the body, when we look at it from the systemic approach, is going to be too big to study. Organs are too big and complex to study. So what we tend to do is we specialize. And one specialty is we could do what's called the science of histology. That means looking at tissues, and even getting smaller than that, looking at histology, or not only histology, but cytology, which is the study of individual cells. Because you're going to learn that cells make up these things called tissues, and tissues make up these things called organs. So this is just as kind of a preview. And this is what the ancient Greeks and Romans had a hard grasp with, because they looked at the body as a fabric filled in with this soul type material, all these fluids. So the physiology was kind of like the soul or the fluids, this mystical stuff, whereas the anatomy part was the fabric of the body, very much like a cloth that contained these living forces. And it really influenced a lot of how they practiced medicine, because like particularly with the Romans, when they sutured a wound, they would consider it more of fixing the fragments. If they were looking at treating certain diseases, then they worked with the humors, the body fluids, or worked with the person holistically to get rid of whatever the cause of their internal strife was. Okay, so we're not going to focus too much on how we study the sciences, but understand particularly in anatomy. Okay, the microscope is a very important tool for us, because it's the only way that we can look at what we call fine structures. That means cells and tissues. And some microscopes could even see at the atomic level, what's called scanning tunneling microscopes, and we're not going to get to that level, because we don't care about what's called the atomic level or quantum level. Okay, pharmacologists might, because that is important in understanding what we call the pharmacodynamics of a drug, how a drug interacts in the body and creates function for that drug. Some people use microscopes to look at the structure, the anatomy. I use microscopes to look at the cytochemistry. That means we have special microscopes that actually you can interpret the chemistry of a cell and actually look at living. So while I'm confusing with terms, sometimes what we do is we take anatomy, histology, cytology, and embryology, means the development of an organism from basically a fertilized egg to an adult, actually to a child. Eventually we give other terminology for the actually maturation, for the development of post-embryo to an adult. But what we can do is lump these studies into something called morphology, meaning how does an organism take its shape and what does its shape mean? Okay, so I'm going to use the term morphology a lot in describing the anatomical or cytological or histological or embryological aspects of a human. Another thing you're going to find me doing, something that I'm going to do in this class, is part of modern anatomy, and this is true of even physicians today, is you don't just look at the organism as a point in time. You don't just look at a 30-year-old patient, a 40-year-old patient. You have to think about how that person got to be 30 or 40 years old, and then look at the plan of what they have now to the point where they might die. So we always think of the human from the perspective of what happened during this person before the time of birth, the moment of birth, and to the point where that leads them to death. So we look at the human as a spectrum of their past history and what their future potential might be, not just as this lump of flesh and chemicals that sits before me. So today, in lectures, you're going to hear me talk about the development of that organ system and various factors that can cause that organ system to not develop properly. And guys, what we're going to learn too is that the environment affects development. And the sad story for a lot of people that study senescence or death, which was part of my PhD research, was that the first 20 years of a human significantly affect the next 40 years of your life. And the first 40 years of your life determine literally your total longevity. So if you've already messed around the first 40 years of your life, you're probably not going to be able to do much. Now, the first 20 years of your life, depending on how severe you did, you still have some time to kind of make it up a little. But you're going to have a little couple of years or other things ticked off as I'm not going to be the healthiest person in the future. One thing we're not going to cover in this class, but I think it is important, and every now and then I will give a comparative approach to how other organisms do things, and I think that is important. But there's this area of science called phylogenesis, and we actually not only look at a human in a point of time as being an individual, but also as being a species. That means, how do we compare ourselves to ancient humans? Okay, and what made us what we are? And because, guys, we have structures called vestigial structures that we find in ancestral creatures. We have what's called silent DNA, which is the same DNA we find in frogs and other creatures that is active. So this is kind of neat to understand our evolutionary history, because guys, our body is still compensating for two-legged standing, and we're not doing a good job of doing it. Anybody that's been pregnant or gotten what are called inguinal hernias knows the consequences of having an upright stance, considering our abdominal muscles were meant for walking on fours. So, there may be some controversy related to this evolutionary process, but we really have to take it into account when looking holistically at a human. And the science of ergonomics takes a look at this. We look at our phylogenesis, we look at what we are today, what we do today, and we try to compensate that with devices that we use every day to make it more comfortable for us and more applicable to how our body works and compensates. So as we start getting into the class, we're going to, in chapter 1, look at this whole idea of the structure of the body and then move into what's called the levels of structural organization. So again, when we look at the body, don't just look at the human as this general organism. We got to think about what's called the organ systems that make us up, and the organs that make up that organ system, and then the tissues that make up that organ, and the cells that contribute to the tissue, because you're going to find tissues are composed of different types of cells, and then each cell is going to be contain different types of organelles or different proportions of organelles and different types of metabolisms going on, and all of this is run by the DNA, and technically each cell has a identical complement of DNA, which we know is not necessarily true in even in an individual, okay, but the DNA works, different aspects of the DNA we're going to see are used differently with different types of cells. And then the DNA itself and the rest of the chemistry that makes up organelles is all going to be based on what's called organic chemistry, or the chemistry of organisms. And this is involve these things, unfortunately, called atoms. We're going to see that there's this particular group of atoms that contributes us. Why do we need to know this chemistry? Because, guys, medicine works at this level, what's called the molecular or chemical level of the cell. So when we adjust the chemistry of the cell, that in a way affects how the structure or the function of everything else works, particularly the organism in itself. And as we develop pharmacological drugs, we have a lot of good information on how those drugs interact with cells, but not necessarily how cells interact with other cells based on that drug and how that ultimately affects the whole organism. And this is where when we get into pharmacology, eventually you're gonna see there's a lot of the unknown, and a lot of things are called side effects, and a lot of variation in the human body when we start adjusting its metabolism using medications or other types of treatments. So as we're studying the human body, okay, so in this class you're going to apply a lot of these clinical examination procedures to look at the bodies and models. We're not going to be working with living bodies, but looking with some real human specimen models and muscle models, plastic ones, whatever. But the whole idea for you in class is to inspect. You can inspect with your visual eye, unaided eye, and also with the microscope on looking at cells. But inspection is very critical. We can also inspect the chemistry of a cell, which we're not going to do much. So we can inspect physiology. We can look at anatomy. Okay, just by sheer visualizing and drawing and recording or photographing information. We can palpate. That means we can touch and feel. And be careful applying this in class, but we will have to know how to recognize superficial features by actually touching and pressing and feeling the strength of a muscle, the subtlety of the skin, feeling the movement of a joint, and is there a clicking that you can feel. We can use it as a way of locating parts, looking at information internally. So palpation is very important. I also want you to touch and feel the bones, feel the subtle shapes of them, and learn those shapes and how that creates their function and position in the body. Percussion, we can tap on the body, okay, and we could also listen to the body through things like stethoscopes and also sphygmomanometers for taking blood pressure. That's all part of listening. And then we could also take measures, and we're not going to do that so much in this class. This is more important in determining age and gender, and also forensic analysis of the body. But anthropometry just means we take these things and put a measure to it, what we call a quantitation. Okay, that helps us to find standards and also looks at whether these things are within a norm. So the metry or measurement part becomes very important later when we get into more allied health or medical training. And then we can do what's called paraclinical. And we hopefully, if they were brought, if we have them available, we can look at x-rays, and we can look at x-rays, either actual ones or ones I pull from online, because these all assist with the process of understanding the human body. It gives us a new type of eye. So we can use instruments that are called paraclinical. That means they help go beyond the classical Greek way that we just looked at in the previous slide of looking at the body superficially or from the gross perspective. Because I think looking at x-rays is very important for you to see the actual position of what these things really look like in the body, particularly bone. Looks very unique. And so do some of the internal organs when you start looking them through x-rays. Okay, and again, there's tomographies, there's MRIs, there's other things we use to visualize the body. But note, we're still doing visualization. or we're looking at chemistry. So all these methods are just going a little more refined on the classical methods that we look at. Now, the biggest problem in this class is terminology. And to be honest with you, I learned different types of terminology for my anatomy. And some of it was based on the nature of the course. Was it a human course or a general course that covered all organism anatomy? Was my professor Italian or German? Was it from a professor that spoke Queen's English or American English? So guys, unfortunately, we have tried in the past to standardize medical terminology, but as you go from country to country, people sometimes add their own terms. The British in general moved away from the Latin terminology into more of an English terminology, or kind of more anglicized it, so it can be more pronounceable to them and more understandable to them. So in the past, we've had these books called anatomicas, okay, of what we call nomenclature. We've had Congress of what's called anatomists, and we've also had Federal Congress of Anatomists. Notice these are in Europe. And then still today, we try to have what are called International Federations of Congress to standardize. And this is always going to be a difficult challenge. But please bear with me as we're going through the course, is that I will sometimes use not just alternative pronunciations, but alternative terms. And don't be frustrated by this. This is particularly true for when we look at cranial nerves, we look at muscle structure, is there's different ways that people categorize the body, and it takes years to sometimes standardize it. Usually what we say is we have to let a generation of scientists or medical doctors die out before the next generation can standardize their terminology. So don't be frustrated, but be familiar that things will have different terms. And I will use different terms for what's in your book. And this, again, is the frustration to students, but just as you're taking notes, write that down. Keep track of those and look at different anatomy resources online or different books in the library to get an idea of the different terminology. So when you're in a situation where you have to know those terms, it's not new to you. Okay, so when we get into anatomical terminology and physiological terminology, much of the early anatomists used this terminology to try to identify the shape, the location, the placement, and the function of that organism. But a lot of what we're going to have to do in this class up front in our first real lecture is look at what we call the anatomical position, which we're going to learn is you kind of standing upright with your hands forward. Actually, your feet are not supposed to be flat. Your feet are supposed to be just standing kind of like on your heels. We're not going to worry about that. That's not doable for people. But that's the anatomical standing position for any clinical analysis, for any x-ray, whatever. And a lot of it has to do with the position of the radius and the ulnar. That means your lower arm bones, and also the tibia and fibula. And keeping them what we call non-overlapped and straight. And also the position of your spine too is part of it. So the anatomical positions would be what we call our starting point. And unfortunately, we're going to have to understand body directions and positions and placements and the location, whether something's at the surface of the skin or deep in the body. So again, don't get frustrated with this. Practice this. Practice this with family members, with colleagues, form study groups to learn these, because these terms are used a lot in clinical and in research situations. And just in your book, when it says the heart is positioned medial, it's deep, in the body, and, and this is a transverse plane, whatever. Please understand that, because it basically is like the body's GPS. So just like knowing north, south, up, and down. We're also going to have to get into the body regions, because the body as a whole I can't just say you have a heart in your body. We have to say we have this heart present in the trunk and that, or the thorax, and that kind of limits where we have to look to find it. And I'm going to give you in lecture a case study about why it's important to know what's called these major, and we're also going to have minor body regions too. We're also going to talk about body cavities, the big C word. And this is going to be a bane for students too, because there's different names for these and they're divided sometimes differently. Okay, depending on what we're looking at. So please, I'm not doing this just for fun. I'm doing this so that we can understand how do we find an organ. Because the old days, we thought the body was this blob. And not everybody. I mean, indigenous people, ancient cultures had an idea what the human body was like when they cut up other animals and when they saw ripped open bodies of colleagues. But we have to understand that where these structures are and where they're positioned all the time. Okay, so and then we're going to have this term called planes or cuts. That means how do we cut the body to understand it internally, and how do we view it when looking at a patient or looking at an X-ray or a tomography or an MRI or anything else. So the term anatomy literally means to cut into, okay, or to cut away. So we're going to have to cut away the body. We're going to get into terms like sagittal, frontal, and horizontal types of planes, okay, or transverse or oblique. These are not covered on this slide, but these are very important in getting your orientation. Again, it's like having a GPS and they say basically, you know, turn right, turn left, or line of sight driving. It means you're looking at where you're driving, not necessarily looking at the north, your relationship to the north or the south. So again, we have to understand these terms and these positions. And these are just, again, look, I'm showing this only because there's some dual terminology here. Frontal or coronal. Frontal is a modern term. Coronal is the ancient term for crown to explain a region of your head where you would wear a tiara or crown. We modernized it to the term frontal to represent the perspective you're looking at where you see most of that bone or the frontal bone. Okay, and we're going to see what are called transverse is similar to horizontal. That means going along the horizon. So again, don't be thrown off by the duplicate terminology. Understand it comes from the fact that we standardized in different places and we haven't ever gotten to a global standardization of anatomical terms. This shows the planes. You'll be learning all this, and again, don't let this diagram get to you. This is a little more detailed than what's going to be in your book, but what we do is we section the body to better understand it and then subdivide it again into its basic components. Okay, and then axes are also going to be, you know, what is the rotation point, the central point. So an axis basically pierces the body as if you're impaling it. But we have to understand that when we're turning the body, from a front view to a back view, we do that on an axis. So we're going to learn about the sagittal axis, the frontal axis, and some of this we actually don't really get into the book. Okay, but the axes do not really divide the body. They give us a rotation point for that body, almost like a central point, not so much a division point. The planes are the division point. Where the planes come together is called an axis. And again, don't be confused by this, but we'll learn this particularly. This is going to be important when we look at body movement. What is the central focus of that body movement? It means basically where is that body movement braced to? And this is called the axis. Okay, and then we're going to start looking at, again, you know, within the body parts themselves. So we can look at the thorax, and we can divide the thorax into different regions, so the pulmonary, to the upper abdominal, okay, or within different positions of the rib cage. We can look at what are called cavities, where the lungs are located in, and so we're going to have a thoracic cavity here, but also an upper abdominal there. And this is looking at from a frontal, okay, a dorsal plane, okay, or rear end plane if you want to call it that, and a lateral or side view. So again, these terms help us to understand when we're looking at divisions in the body, what are we looking at, and where do things fit into the divisions. Okay, and I want to get back to this concept of the norm, and this is where we're going to end. So guys, when you think about it, don't look at norm as being healthy. Look at norm as being the body that you find in 88% of the population. Now guys, we got to be careful about this, because we do know that there are different body norms for people from different ethnicities. I hate using the term race, but different racial groups, and women and men, males and females. which is again sometimes an arbitrary category, because actually in the human sexuality literature we have at least 7 different categories of the human gender spectrum. Okay, some called ambiguous, that means you can't tell. Okay, so when we look at this norm, we have to look at it within the population you're dealing with. And what killed us in the past with medicine, and particularly even true in pharmacology today, is that we have this norm that was based on literally in the past of a white male population. And for females, it was a white female population when we first started getting norms for that. So the norm, there is no normal human. And this is funny because in the military, I learned this when they look at people for different positions, particularly in the Air Force. And I had the body that was perfect for a fighter pilot because I fit in the canopy perfectly. That sounds kind of funny, but we had these instruments designed for a particular person. Now, my skills were not meant for it, but my body size was, and it's really funny. So when we have a norm, the term norm basically means we pick this average for everybody in which nobody really fits, except really a tiny part of the population. And then some of us fit kind of loosely, some better than others. And it was really funny watching when I was in flight school, watching these giant people squeeze into a cockpit and have trouble using it, although under other circumstances they could have been wonderful agile pilots. But the restraints of that norm of what the F-15 was designed for, it didn't fit their body to give them maximum use of their skills. So we got to be careful here. And when I talk about abnormal, what I really mean are variants. And yes, some variants are actually a disease. It's something that harms the body. But we have to pay attention to the environmental factors too. So something may harm the body in Houston under our environmental conditions, but not northern Alaska. We're learning in spaceflight that different levels of oxygen can have significant effects on a person's, lung capacity, the health of their lungs, the size of their lungs, whatever. Significant differences that we don't know a norm. So we have to deal with variations. We have to understand that some variations, yes, do lead to pathology, but others are just variations, and we can't add too much explanation to them without being wrong. Abnormality, again, be careful with. It just means we're not within the norm measurement. Again, within this set of what we call 88% of the population. And believe me, of that 88%, there's a small percent that's borderline of the abnormal. Sometimes in statistics we call this the tails or the standard deviations, but deviation also sounds like a bad term too. When someone statistically says deviation, it don't mean, oh my gosh, you're a deviant, you're bad. It just means you're outside of the normal range. So guys, with blood pressure, there's a normal range and a deviation range. The deviation range in some cases may be normal for a person, that particular person, but it may be not for other. And this behooves, it really bothers doctors when they deal with this, because they can try to treat that range, bring it to the normal, and find out that the patient does worse. We sometimes learn this with people that have obesity. You bring them down to the normal range, and all of a sudden this body starts dysfunctioning. And or you take a person that's underweight and try to bring them to average weight, and that causes problems with organ systems, with their immune system, and with their fat cells. So again, be careful when you hear about abnormality. It is the variation that we find in humans, and sometimes we have to come up with a line to cut and say, this is disease and this is not. And it can be arbitrary. It could also be absolute, what we recognize as something that does shorten life or impairs the ability to live. So when we find abnormalities that disturb what we call the equilibrium, or you're going to learn the term homeostasis, then we try to treat it. And sometimes we actually have abnormalities of the equilibrium. That means, how does the body bring itself back to health? Okay, so we can look at anatomical, developmental, physiological anatomies, all sorts. And sometimes, and this is based on the old Greek and Roman and Italian views of the body, that they looked at their own bodies and looked at other people's bodies as being sometimes monstrosities or terratisms. So sometimes when we see incredibly extremes of the body, in the old days we called these monstrosities, which sounds kind of negative, and it is, or terratisms. And sometimes you hear the term teratoma. It's a type of tumor that is very abnormal. Okay, and again, it just means terrible. Actually, terror comes from the term terrible or monster. Okay, and again, when we can look at embryology even, what is the proper rate, the normal rate of development, and how is a child supposed to come out? What is the norm in size? I remember for my own kids, my daughter in particular was in the one standard deviation lower than what she should have been for her embryological development and size and growth. And she turned out pretty normal, pretty okay. She's short, so am I, so's her mom. But the thing is, when we compared her to the population in this country, her development tended to be slower. Okay, which is, it's not a pathology, it's just a variation. Yes, in some cases, like in a case of midgetism, it can be a problem, or in dwarfism, particularly with leg and bone growth, it can be a problem. It's funny because when we look at animals, like in pets, in adoption, what we call dwarfism is a variation of a dog we call adoption in a way. We raise it to have a disease that in humans is called dwarfism. Now, for the dachshund itself, it may cause problems, but the dachshund also has particular characteristics that make it successful for what they were bred for, too. So, another thing you're going to hear, particularly in the kinesiology and health news and literature, is body style. And your book doesn't cover this because this is kind of sometimes considered fake science, which we hear a lot today, but it wasn't a start. It was a way to fully understand human health and nutrition and human form and function. And also, it was used for ethnicity, which unfortunately reared its ugly side during the Middle Ages and also during the Nazi and apartheid ages, when people were using body style as a way of discriminating racially and ethnically. And believe me, I know that from personal experience of having families that our anatomy was held under scrutiny to the point of putting us to death or exiling us from a country. So you'll hear these body styles, and I've learned them from in the Russian literature, funny enough. And you see this still very popular in Russian medicine, where they, in Eastern European medicine, where they use this as an indicator of classifying a person first before they treat them clinically or look at them clinically. So you'll hear these terms called ectomorph. Also, the similar term is hypersthenic, which means over. Ecto just means outer or above. And dolichomorphic, that's a killer. Okay, and these are all terms that just describe a person that goes beyond the norm in a certain way. And you'll see pictures of this. And again, we're not going to cover this much in class, but you'll hear this. And you'll sometimes even have to classify a person into this, because this is a very important in looking at chest ratios. We know this is important for space flight. If you have a particular chest to abdomen ratio or body ratio, that's going to affect your ability to withstand gravity changes and atmospheric pressure changes. And then we have what is called the endomorphic, asthenic, or brachymorphic. Okay, brachy, you're going to learn a little later. You're going to see that term a lot. Okay, brachy means to be less of, like brachycardia, less of a body, of a heart rate. Okay, or in some cases pulse rate. Okay, and these are people that tend to have body parameters that tend to be shortened to what we expect. And then is the normostatic. Aesthetic comes from the term aesthetic, means looks, what you look like. So you look normal. Mesomorphic just means you're the middle shape, you're the normal shape. Mesos means middle or norm. So again, this is what technically humans were supposed to be, and we're not going to worry about that, okay, because we now know we all have genes that help us to resemble Neanderthal, whether they actually came from Neanderthal or not. They may be residual genes or ancestries that sometimes make us a little different. They might make us hypermorphic, hypersthenic. So bear in mind that these are just genetic variations again. Now, within your family, if you're all of one type and you're born another, this now may mean you can have a condition, a developmental condition, or an endocrine condition, sort of like acromegaly. So these can be used in an absolute sense for a family, but this could also be due to ethnic differences. So again, I'm just mentioning this because you see these terms. And I'm sorry, the only good overhead I have of this is in Russian, and I can read it. At least you may not be able to. But there's your asthenic, and notice that these are people that are supposedly kind of missing or below the norm, and notice that they're taller and skinny. That's actually normo. That I know that looks kind of funny, but that's H's and that what looks like a P to use an R or whatever. So so there's your so-called normal person, and I kind of like the way he's just standing still and she's just kind of, swaggering. Okay, and then you have your people that have the more broader chest. They tend to be shorter looking, okay, thicker. So these are your hyper, growth people. And again, these are just ways of measuring the body, what we call morphometrics. This is important in some areas of anatomy and physiology, in particular what we call ergonomics, and also in kinesiology. It's also important in sport medicine because, guys, this type of shape is different than this type of shape in how the body functions in movement. So please, don't memorize these as much as be aware that these could be measures that you come across every now and then, hopefully in English and not in Cyrillic. And last but not least, that is the end. Most of our lectures are going to be based on our slide content. So I will abbreviate the slides because some of the slides tend to be, hundreds of slides long. And I will just give you a basic lecture that's on the major part of the lecture. Use the test samples. I gave you all your test samples as an example of what's going to be in your chapters. So guys, the PowerPoints are, the content is important. I will tell you what's most important. The test reviews will tell you what's really important. So that's all, folks.